Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
We're most pleased to bring you a program with a guest that was with us in January during the Dr. Martin Luther King Week in our city and community, actually more than one city. The Coeur d'Alene and Post Falls school districts for 20 years have joined the North Idaho College Popcorn Forum and the Human Equality Club at this institution, along with the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations, and most recently the new organization, the Human Rights Education Institute, to have a week studying human rights. We welcome to the program that gentleman that was here this year for the 20th anniversary of that series with the children in our schools. We welcome Bob Williams. Mr. Williams is from Seattle. He's an actor, and he's with a wonderful organization called Living Voices. And to our viewers, we'd recommend schools throughout the region that this would be a wonderful group to bring to your community. He is a former student at the University of Maryland, where he studied acting and theater, and then he attended the Freehold Theater in Seattle and has been there since 1995 in that city. In his program, he does what is called interactive video production with the children. On this program today, we particularly want to talk about his work in relation to the civil rights movement in the United States, and particularly what happened in the 1950s and 60s in the South, although he goes all the way back to the 1600s in that very unfortunate time, and a terrible time when there was slavery in our society. With that, Mr. Williams, we welcome you to the program. We're delighted to have you here, and you've been very powerful with the students in our school districts in January while you were here. Thank you again for your wonderful, generous contributions.
Well, thank you, Tony. Thanks for having me here today.
And I'm very pleased to have our two regular panelists, Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Erna Reinhardt, who is Director of Public Relations at North Idaho College, and Janelle will commence today's questioning.
It's a pleasure to have you here and to talk with you. Please explain to our viewers just briefly what interactive video production is. And then a second part of that question, who provides your background historical, the information that you use in that video production?
Well, the Living Voices production, as a Living Voices production would come to your school or your church or your civic organization, you would see a performer giving a 25-minute or so personal monologue, but also interacting with video images. So as I would sit in a chair next to a projected screen or a TV monitor, I would tell a story as a character that lived back in those days, and as the character speaks, voices on the tape would speak to the character, and the actor would answer back. So as I tell the students, it's like a movie and a play going on at the same time having a conversation. And through that, they can hopefully see a person going through the things that happened in the civil rights movement. As you see the character that I play, Raymond Hollis, from a young age at 6 years old, up as a high school student, as a college student, becoming parts of the sit-ins, and as an adult running for office in his own hometown.
And who provides your historical background?
The historical background was a lot of research that we had done. Now, Rachel Atkins is the writer in Seattle that wrote the script for the show that I do, The Right to Dream. And Michael McClinton has put together a great video presentation and edited all the various images that we use to present to the classrooms together. So, and some of those are some things that we've shot ourselves to piece together some of the archival footage that we've gotten, and he's done some great research back with the Library of Congress and other archival sources for old video clips that we can use in our production.
All right.
Hi, Bob. Welcome to the show. The program that you brought to Kootenai County in January was called The Right to Dream, and yes. I'm real interested. I would like for you to share with our viewers some of the content of that program itself and the character Raymond that you portray.
Mm-hmm. What the children see in Raymond Hollis is a young man whose father fought in World War II, who experienced being treated as a hero by white people that didn't even speak the same language in a foreign country, and then had to come back to having a hard time finding a job, even as a veteran of that war. As explained in the script, Raymond's mother was a nurse, a registered nurse, so a woman with an education and various skills, and after coming back from the war, is actually where his parents met, still has trouble finding work as a nurse because there aren't any black hospitals in her community, and so she resorts to being a domestic laborer and working in those kinds of conditions. So Raymond has seen those kinds kinds of things, and the disappointment of his parents. And his parents, realizing that for their children, want to change things in the future. And Raymond himself is encouraged to make the future a better place for himself and hopefully his children that he might have in the future.
And tell us a little bit about the time frame of the 60s. What was happening in the country during that time?
Well, we were talking about from the time his parents got back from the war. And remember, these were people that came, white and black soldiers came back sailing on ships side by side, got on trains together in Grand Central Station in New York City to get a free ride back home on the government. And when they got to places like Washington, D.C., were told to segregate the cars. Many of these black soldiers that now had to walk to the back of the train were now cut off from actual passenger cars with seats and a dining car and an actual bathroom, and were riding through the heat to places like Mississippi and Alabama behind cars full of pigs and the smell and those kinds of things. And also, as they walked to the back of the trains, many of these soldiers noticed that there were actual prison cars with captured German soldiers in them. So these soldiers that had helped to capture some of these prisoners were actually meant to ride even further behind them, because the laws in the states, in places like Virginia and North and South Carolina, said that no matter who these people were, the fact that they were white people, even though they were the people trying to destroy America, had more of a right to a bathroom than these soldiers did. So those are some of the things that were immediately seen, especially for somebody who grew up in a small town, to see the rest of the world and to see that coming back, wanted to instill in their children. So Raymond hears these stories from his parents, and as a young man realizes he needs to get an education and to better and further himself. And he ends up going to Tougaloo in Mississippi, which is a historically black college, and does very well there, becomes a class president. And when he hears about the sit-ins and hears about Rosa Parks and Dr. King, becomes very activated himself. So he becomes part of the movement himself, and as a young man becomes a leader of the young people in his own community.
Excellent.
Bob, you're very powerful, and I had the privilege of watching the whole production. We have some things in our country, like all countries, not to be proud of, to be very, very disappointed. We have things to be proud of. Mm-hmm. And we, in your presentation, you indicate that we've made great progress from that past very dark period in our history to a period in which, through civil rights legislation and change in people's hearts and change in culture, that life's a lot better. We're not through with our progress, we know, but based on those introductory comments, also share with our viewers, particularly the young people like you've done here, in addition to the segregation in the South on the buses and not able to stay at a lot of hotels or eat at different places. That's the segregation part. Share also why that it was so unfair that people in the African American community and others, communities of color, could also not participate in the political process and vote. Because that's part of your production too. That what was the struggle to get the right to vote?
Well, one of the main reasons that the vote was very important for to be kept from black people is because many of the places where slaves had been held had a majority black population by the time of the end of the Civil War. If you were a slave owner, it was important for you to increase your slave population. There were many ways to do that without any particular cost to yourself, meaning you wouldn't have to buy any further slaves. Slaves as human beings would end up reproducing themselves. So if you had a plantation in operation since the 1600s, over 200 years, you may never have to buy another new slave. And in many places by the end of the Civil War, some counties or congressional districts had an 80% black population. So if the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that were new from the federal government actually were enacted in the southern states, everybody would have a right to vote, and the white people in those counties would have to let the black people decide who the mayor was going to be or who the sheriff was going to be, who's on the school board or city council, or who may even represent them in Washington, D.C. as their senators or representatives. And these were the people that just fought a war, were willing to die and kill other white people to keep those kind of things from happening. So they used state laws, county laws, and their own city ordinances to make sure those kinds of things didn't happen, to counteract the federal laws that had been in place.
So the civil rights movement, and there's so many people were involved in it. Of course, the most famous was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference leading a lot of the marches. But there was more than one facet of this movement. In other words, trying to end segregation of facilities and public accommodations, also trying to get the right to vote. So there were a lot of hurdles to overcome.
Very many hurdles to overcome. Education was primary importance. Even if you were allowed to vote and you couldn't read, you couldn't fill out a ballot.
And it was a crime to teach for a long time. It was a crime to teach African Americans to read and write.
Oh yes, a teacher could be punished by the law. Yes, if it was known that they had a black student, and many black people that knew how to read or write would be encouraged to keep that a secret. As a slave, it might have been reason to actually destroy or kill the slave or send them away, because you wouldn't want them to teach other people to know how to read. And education in many different kinds of forms. Knowing about Africa was something you didn't want black people to know. And black Americans didn't know much about Africa except for Tarzan movies until the 1960s. You didn't hear very many black people calling themselves African. In many communities, it was almost a slur to call a darker skinned person an African. Black people insulting other black people by referring back to Africa. So it wasn't until the 60s where James Brown said something, encouraged people to say it loud, "I'm black and I'm proud," or something like "black is beautiful," were revolutionary thoughts at that time. So that was a relatively new thinking in America for black people, to be proud of themselves, to be proud of being black, and to be proud of being from Africa, and to look towards learning that kind of history of Africa. But history of all kinds of other things, even learning to swim, was something that culturally wasn't something that white people wanted black people to know how to do. For slave reasons, it just kept them from being able to escape across a river. If somebody escaped, they would have to cross a bridge, and it was easier to monitor those kinds of things. And later, of course, it was just a social thing, white and black people or white people not wanting to share the same kind of water that black people had swum in the case of a public pool or some situation like that. So all different kinds of education were restricted to black people in many fronts. And in many places, if it wasn't officially restricted by law, it was discouraged.
Or there were social pressures.
Social pressures, yes.
Janelle Burke.
I want to follow up on Tony's question about education. Please share with us what Raymond would have encountered in his educational experience as a child, and then what he really was working for when he later became active in the civil rights movement, what he wanted to accomplish.
Well, as a young person, Raymond's mother was a domestic, and he was living in the maids' quarters. So as far as his address, he was in a proper school district to go to the majority white school that had better facilities. Many states, in the case of Mississippi and some other states, they spent as much as 4,000% more on the white schools than the black schools. So separate but equal, just because there was a building for the black children to go to school in wasn't necessarily equal. And of course, Raymond knew that very much so. There were things like school buses would carry white children to school, but black children would have to walk. The facilities, sometimes there were no books, or the books that they had were 20 or 30 years old, leftovers or hand-me-downs, sometimes specifically defaced on purpose before they were donated to the black schools to use. So education was much harder. You'd have to try a lot harder to get yourself educated as a black person than a white person who might take such things for granted.
Did a lot of students drop out at an early age?
A lot of students might have dropped out at an early age, either maybe to go and work for their family. It might not have, in their family, it might not have seen as important a thing to do, and it also might have been social pressure as well. In the script, there's a portion where Raymond comes home from university to visit his parents from the summer, and as he walks down the street, he overhears white men talking about that nigger up at Tougaloo, and so he already knows that the white people don't really appreciate that this kid is going to be college educated, and don't like him walking around in their community, wondering that if he does go out there and get that kind of enlightenment, he might bring that back to his community, and they wouldn't want him encouraging others to go and do similar things.
Erna.
Share with us some of the audiences that you've performed, because I know you've taken this on the road. And is there an age group that you would say is more that is better to receive this message, or is it for all audiences?
I think the message is for all audiences. I think Living Voices officially says this is for about 5th grade and up, and I don't think that's because of the message in the story. I think some of the words that are used and some of the images, we actually show an image of a lynching, and so I think for younger grades that might be a little too harsh, but the story I think is appropriate for all ages. I think students maybe before high school are probably more acceptable to these kind of images, simply because they haven't learned to be too cool to raise their hand and inquire. All this week, or the week that I was back in January in Coeur d'Alene, I had to cut my pieces short and not answer all the questions. There were still hands raised at the end of just about every performance, which was just great to see that the kids had more that they wanted to learn about this subject, and more that they wanted to tell me about what they wanted to learn. Some communities, and Coeur d'Alene was great in the way they set up everything, and all the students being very well prepared for the message that they were going to get. In some communities, I can tell when I walk in the building, they haven't even necessarily read our preparatory packet. When I walk in the building, they haven't read the brief synopsis of the story, and they wonder if I'm going to play Martin Luther King or recreate his I Have a Dream speech when they have in their hands the packet that we've sent them weeks before. So some places have actually been ordered, I guess by the school district, to have some sort of program for Martin Luther King Day or for Black History Month, and they may have just chosen our name out of a hat and decided to have this person come for that day. And in those cases, at those places, I find it very much important, and I usually talk a lot faster and try to include as much information as possible, because I know for the 45 minutes I'm there in that school might be the only 45 minutes in their whole 12 years of education that they may ever hear about such things.
I have a follow-up two-part question. Share with us one of your favorite reactions that you've had from a young person that has witnessed your presentation, and also I'm very interested in a personal highlight that you've experienced by doing this.
I don't know if it's a favorite reaction, but one of the things I noticed, I was in Boise a few years ago, and I was at two different schools, but in the course of 90 minutes, I was speaking to the children at the private school. I think it was the Catholic Academy. Well, let me talk at the public school. After we had talked about, our script mentions that Raymond's father was killed by the Klan, but we never mentioned Ku Klux Klan specifically by name. So at the end of the piece, one of the children raised his hand and actually said that his grandfather was part of the Klan. And I said, a lot of people used to be part of the Klan, and he sort of corrected me and said, not was, he actually is an ongoing, they have pictures of him in his regalia back at home. So, and the other students were interested to know about what that meant in his family. So there was a person in the room that had a family connection to a group like the Ku Klux Klan. And then not 90 minutes later, across town at a different school, I had a child raise his hand and ask me, what's the Klan? And so these two kids who lived in the exact same community and probably played in the same playground or walked past each other in the mall had very different experiences. And so in that case, in that kind of situation, I'm very glad that the community had brought me in to tell these kinds of stories, so both of those children would know a whole lot more about groups like the Ku Klux Klan.
And how about a personal highlight of yourself?
I guess one of my favorites, I think it was my first week doing the show, and I was very nervous because I had barely gotten the timing down with the script and the timing with the tape, because as you know, if I speak too slowly, the videotape will answer me back before I ask a question. So after getting all that just barely down, there was a young girl who was in tears, and she came up to me and wanted to give me a hug and wanted my autograph. And that just made me proud and glad of what I was doing, and I was just happy. And I've been doing it now for 8 years or so now with Living Voices.
I have to put a plug in and say about our wonderful school districts in this area, such as the ones that you've been at, Post Falls and Coeur d'Alene, and there are others. They truly are committed and been for many years, and they do prepare the students. And like the program that you were here this week, that's been going on for 20 years every year in dealing with the children and human rights and honoring Dr. King. Something else in your presentation that's so powerful, and it shows a generation issue in the role that you played. This young man grew up in a very difficult situation, but he was so successful, went on to college, he became president of the student body and joined the marches and the movement. And his parents were very concerned, in fact, discouraging him to come home. It might affect them. This is a very emotional and moving story. Tell that story about how the father came around to be part of that, and then also what happened to the father.
His father, as a veteran, had come back from the war, as I said, to be treated like a second-class citizen after being treated like a hero. So he had become sort of defeatist and had become kind of a depressed person. There's a part of our story where Raymond's father has a battalion reunion with his old Army buddies, and for a moment, Raymond sees his father's pride swell up again. He sees his father back in his old uniform. But as they go downtown to get on a bus to go to the reunion, the bus driver tells him to step off and wait. His father stands up to the man, and Raymond says, "This is the first time I've ever seen my father talk back to a white man," and says, "I'm a soldier, I was in combat." And the bus driver says, "You're nothing but a nigger," and he closes the door and leaves them, and they never make it to that reunion. And so his father sort of falls back into his depression. But as Raymond takes on that mantle as a young man and becomes involved in the sit-ins, Raymond himself is discouraged when one of his friends is wounded at a sit-in. And in talking to his father finally tells him, "I understand what you're going through. I've been through a war." And even Raymond and his father sort of have a discussion. It's not the same thing, but yet it is the same thing. It's a different different kind of combat, but it's still kind of a fight for human rights, like they were fighting to liberate the children of Europe from Hitler's racism. Raymond and his father, again, joins him in the fight to liberate the American children from the racism that they know they're facing back in America. By the end of the play, Raymond makes it to the march from Selma to Montgomery, and Raymond again is discouraged by some of the violence that happens on Bloody Sunday. And in the midst of all of that, he sees his father. His father shows up at the end to join him at the march onto Montgomery, into the final speech. So his father finally says, I'm very, very proud of you, and I'm here to join you. And that's sort of a cathartic moment for both of those men to go on into the future. And so our story sort of ends with the two of them seeing Martin Luther King speak on the steps that day.
But then a tragedy happens. The father shows his courage at this point. The sons had a lot to do with that. But then there's tragedy for the father.
Right. Earlier in the play, when Raymond sees his father depressed and sad, he kind of calls, from as long as I can remember, my father was a broken man. When Raymond's father returns from that big march full of pride, he is murdered by the Ku Klux Klan. And Raymond's speech is, he did not die a broken man, he'd be a proud man, and he's proud today. So Raymond's father had found his heart and his soul and his courage again, even though he didn't live much longer than that. Both Raymond and his father got to see that part of him come back to life.
It's an extremely powerful moment in your presentation. There may be school districts. We cover a lot of states and into Canada, and this message is so powerful that there might be some church, religious organization that might be interested. We need to give our viewers a way of getting in touch with Living Voices, and so I believe they put something in our system. If not, would you tell the people how to get in touch?
People can reach Living Voices at livingvoices.org. There'll be a brief synopsis of all the stories that we do tell. The Right to Dream and the Civil Rights story is just one of the many stories we do tell. We tell stories of human rights and Americans and all of their experience. We have stories about the internment of Japanese Americans, the discrimination that Irish Americans faced as they came to America. We have stories about people from the Dust Bowl, the Okies making their way to California, and the kinds of things that they went through. Our news program is called La Causa, which tells a story of Cesar Chavez and the migrant farm workers and some of the things that those people went through. So there should be a story that's appropriate for just about every age and every school and every part of history that the people will be covering. If the kids are reading The Grapes of Wrath or if they're reading The Diary of Anne Frank, we have a story that might be appropriate for them. So livingvoices.org has a brief synopsis of all of those stories and gives great details about what we do.
Thank you. And I have one final question before I go back to the panel, and that is just briefly about the future, because you're very optimistic in many ways in your presentation. What advice do you have, particularly for young people, about how they, we recognize the progress and the changes, but we have other work to do? And what would you say to young people today?
Well, the best thing is to be aware. I've pointed out in many of the schools, especially many of the newer schools, a very easy thing I did was just in the very building where I'm giving the presentation was walk over to any door. In most of the newer buildings, they have handles instead of doorknobs, and that's a simple thing, but that's because of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that's a piece of civil rights legislation passed way back in 1990, which is the far past for the fifth graders, but it's something that has to do with civil rights, and it doesn't specifically have to do with anybody's race. If they can see that and see a physical example of something like that, they can see how things can be different and how things can change. A simple thing that a handle, how hard it is to turn a handle if you don't have a thumb or fingers, or how hard it is to turn a knob without your thumb or fingers, and how easy it is with the handle and why those things are in place. They can see things getting better in the future. I encourage them to think about their own lifetimes. Even a fifth grader can realize there weren't very many DVDs at the time they were born. And if they can see that kind of change, they can realize in 20 or 30 years, they might be telling their children about stories in history. One of the things we talk about is some of the horrible images and things that happened in the past, and those fifth graders may someday be telling their children about the events of September 11th, 2001. And they might seem like old people because they were born back in the 20th century, in the past millennium even, from when their children were born. So I encourage them to talk to the oldest person they know in their family so they can get a perspective of somebody that they know that might have lived through that part of history. And they'll be able to tell those stories to their children in the future.
Thank you. Janelle Berg.
When you make your presentation, is there a favorite part of that presentation that you would like to share with us?
I guess my favorite part is probably the ending. One of the last things Raymond says, it's time to make a change in this world, and I'm going to do everything I can. And then he says to the audience, what will you do? And this week has been a great week here, or the week I did in Coeur d'Alene was a great week, because after that the children were thinking, I could see, and hands were up all over, and everybody was thinking of something they could do. Children were asking me for suggestions of things that they could do, or suggesting to me things that they could do in the community. So to see a great reaction and a great activity of all the students in the community out here was wonderful, and it's great to see them engaged in such an activity.
Reinhardt.
Bob, share with us how you got involved with Living Voices.
I actually went and saw a performance of a piece that they do called Through the Eyes of a Friend, a piece also written by Rachel Atkins, which tells the story of a young woman who was a friend of Anne Frank's, who went to the camps with her. And it was just an amazing performance that I saw, and the format with the person acting with the video was just amazing. So I went to talk to the actress afterwards and just congratulate her on a wonderful performance. And I happened to mention that I was also an actor, and she had told me that they were writing a piece called The Right to Dream, and they were looking for actors. So just through that brief conversation, I got a phone number and got an audition with the Living Voices organization. And I was very lucky to have done so, and I've been with them ever since.
Excellent.
We don't have a whole lot of time left, but we have some. And Bob, in addition to your work with Living Voices, which again we've indicated is very powerful, you as an actor do other things too. Would you share some of the other things that you do in your life and in your community in Seattle?
Well, sure. Well, some of the people that are watching this now might have seen me last year at the Spokane Interplayers doing Lobby Hero. That was probably the thing anybody around in this area might have seen me do. And there were other projects that I've done at the Empty Space Theater in Seattle and around town. So if you're ever out in Seattle, you can look me up, and you might see something. Hopefully, you might see me on a stage near you.
Great. A very wonderful man, a native of Idaho named Greg Carr, who now lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, has just built a new facility, and he's very generous in contributions on human rights work around the world, and certainly has been generous to this community with over, actually, in addition to $1 million, other monies to North Idaho College and all. And he says that he's convinced now that theater is one of the most powerful mediums to use to address civil rights and human rights. Would you elaborate upon this new approach that Mr. Carr is using?
I believe so, yeah. I think theater can be very, very active because you see a live person in front of you rather than watching a video, especially with the young people today, watching a video when you can see something with people like us. We've seen live people on video, but with all the special effects and computer-generated things, the people might not even realize that what they're seeing is actually happened. I had an experience where it was a younger group that had seen our video, and one of the little girls had a question afterwards about the lynching scenes, and she asked, were those people really, was that a real photograph? And when I told her it was, she burst out into tears because she hadn't quite made that connection that what she had saw was real. But by seeing a live actor on the stage going through something like that, especially with the story of Raymond, when you see him at 6 years old and 16 and 26, they can see what happens to a real person in a real life. And someone in the room with you having it, I think, is very effective.
We've had that experience here at North Idaho College. Over a 7-year period, we did Chautauqua performances of people in history, and the students here said it's the easiest way they have ever learned. It really impacts and stays with you. Mm-hmm. A majority of people are visual learners. On that note, Bob Williams, we have to bring the program to a conclusion. It's been great having you in Coeur d'Alene back in January when you were here, and that's when we were taping the program, and you are very powerful, and we encourage you and wish you well in your future work. Ladies and gentlemen, we've so much enjoyed bringing you a very serious topic, but a very important one, dealing with the dignity of all persons and what we need to do to promote that. Hope you'll be with us again next week at this same time when we'll discuss yet another issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.